Hello and welcome back to the higher level chess course. I hope you've had a chance to watch the previous couple of videos. Last week we talked a little bit about, first of all, the endgame theme of getting around the back of pawns and using their lack of mobility to your advantage, especially when you have a rook endgame or maybe a major piece endgame. That's very important. Also, we talked a little bit about fighting spirit. Now, that's not something you can really define that easily in chess, but I think it encompasses things like realizing when you're losing that you need to try to change things. Okay, I don't mean it in general, but I mean in the game itself. So imagine that your opponent is a couple of pawns ahead, or maybe a piece ahead, perhaps, and suddenly their queen comes down to try to challenge yours. Should you swap or should you avoid the swap? Well, I think in most circumstances, you don't want to swap queens. You want to avoid the swap. Because if you swap queens, you're losing effectively your most powerful piece. And there's therefore less chance that you'll be able to create something yourself to change the course of the game. I always think of it in maybe a bit of a gruesome way, but imagine that you're on a train and it's going on a line like this and it's going towards the edge of a cliff. Would you jump out or would you keep going and hope it stops? Well, it's not a great choice, but maybe you can, if you jumped out, at least you're not going to plummet over the edge. But there's always a chance, I suppose, that you might do that. So imagine again, in a less gruesome sense in chess, you want to try to give yourself every chance of saving the game or maybe even winning. So that brings me back to the example that I showed you last week. I'll just share the screen now so you can see. Now, I know you can see the sort of the moves on the right-hand side, but if you can avoid them, that's great to try and concentrate on the board itself. By the way, you might want to set the board up as well. So just pause the video if you need to set this board up, and you can consider what you might play here. I think this is the puzzle I said last week. So I'm going to ask you guys what you would play. Well, I think the answer really is got to be an aggressive move. It can't be a move such as this, really, because even though that might cover the pawn here from coming forward, you're never going to be able to save the game this way, because white has such an advantage. White can pick up this pawn anytime they like, and this pawn here is going to eventually kill black. So I think better to play a more aggressive move. So queen d1 was what happened in the game. And this is a good move for two reasons. Firstly, it's a check. So it means that white has to react to what you're doing. You're the one now more in control. And secondly, this is actually a tactical idea because it's a fork. Notice we're attacking the king, but also this pawn. And we're getting around the back of these pawns. So notice that what I mentioned in the previous lesson and at the very beginning, that these pawns here cannot be defended by other pawns from the back. The only way that this pawn would be able to be defended would be to advance like this, but these two pawns are isolated, they're on their own, and therefore they can only be defended by a move such as queen back here, maybe another move, maybe with the bishop, something like that. But they are certainly weak. Now, I think black made a good decision because he realized that this bishop here is actually in a good position to stop this pawn coming through if necessary. So if worse came to worse, then black could, in theory, swap the bishop for this pawn here. Meanwhile, his queen can wreak havoc on the other side of the board. So this is kind of like a counter-attack, you could say. So white moves the king, that's the only move. And again, we've got a chance here to gain material. So we're now, I believe, fewer pawns behind than we were before. But more importantly, we have a bit of a hold on the game. We're suddenly creating threats of our own across here. Notice that if this queen perhaps snatched the pawn here, then, well, I'd like to sort of look at this possibility. What would you do in this situation? This is another interesting point. Pause the video. Well, my inkling here is to try a check. So again, go for something like a perpetual check. Notice that if white comes out here, then, well, we can just copy, or perhaps better even than that, maybe we could come into this square, something like that, and then black actually can't move the king back. But assuming here that we're aiming for a draw, any moves such as this, or any backwards moves, can be met with a check. So something like that, maybe like this. So I think white would have to try something like that. And then again, we go in for a check. We're trying to change the course of the game. We want to make sure that white doesn't have a moment's peace. So again, I think the bishop has to come back. Well, then what do we do? Well, how are we going to get to the king this time? Again, pause the video, see if you would see if you can come up with an idea. I think, again, a move such as this would work really well, because again, we're threatening two things. Firstly, the pawn coming forward. Secondly, the pawn taking here. Both of those are very strong moves, and you know, they put white under a lot of pressure. And again, so I think this is going to happen. And again, white's king is more exposed than it was before. It's going to be quite hard, especially with this bishop now a little more active, perhaps. It's going to be very hard for white to avoid checks, and he may even get into more serious trouble than that. So that is the way that black has to play. So in this game, white is probably, I would say, probably ill-advised to take this pawn. It's a little bit risky. Instead, white decides to try to swap the queens, because this pawn here is still very important, and it's going to take a lot of black's energy to stop it from getting to the end, getting a queen. Meanwhile, I would say, well, there's perhaps a small chance that this pawn may be able to get to the end if we can get rid of this one. But bear in mind that any bishop move is going to allow this pawn to come forward. So I just don't think it's going to be worth black's time. So swapping the queens, I think, would be good for white, because white is ultimately in a better position. But black doesn't do this. Black decides to keep the queens on the board and maximize his chance of winning. So, okay, well, if black's not going to have this queen swap, then I guess white's got to go onto the attack. Suddenly, king is attacked. Notice we can't really do this move because we'll be unprotecting the bishop, and black and white can simply take. That's actually an interesting motif, which we'll come to in a second. Because notice this pawn is still not that far away from getting to the end. The only piece that's stopping it is the bishop. So if we can get into position, we may be able to sacrifice queen for bishop at an opportune moment. So king here, d7, the pawn is getting closer. Okay, so now this threat is a real possibility. Queen takes bishop, followed by pawn to the end, and regaining the queen. So we're kind of gaining a bishop for a pawn here, which is not bad. There's not really that much that can be done to prevent this from happening, except arguably moving the queen somewhere where it can stop the pawn getting to the end. So, for example, queen here would be okay. The move that was chosen was queen to d2, so it's a similar idea, effectively blocking the pawn getting to the end. Now, bishop to e3 was played, and this is a point where I think black perhaps went down a very risky road, because, okay, we've got a couple of pawns back now. Do we try to hang on? Do we try to maybe play a move like queen here? That seems like maybe an idea, again with a check, the idea of check. Black decided to snatch another pawn like this, and then the trick came into use. We had, okay, we can't get the pawn to the end at the moment, but we're going to sacrifice the queen. Notice that there's not much black can do here. There's no checks available currently, which means that there's no counterattack. So white is actually now back in control of the game. It then promotes the pawn, and we get to this situation. Now, it's actually very interesting because in the end game, pawns do kind of increase a little bit more in value. If you compare pawns here to the bishop, we'll notice that black now has a couple of passed pawns that can get to the end without being impeded by an enemy pawn. I think this pawn in particular, this one here, the one on c4, is becoming more and more dangerous, because if black can use the queen to shepherd the pawn to the end, then, well, he'll end up with two queens and then he'll win the game. So arguably, these pawns, this one in particular, is getting close to the value of this bishop. The bishop is worth 3, or roughly 3¼ points, maybe 3, we'll say. But as the endgame wears on, the pawns become collectively stronger. Imagine that we remove the queens from the board, and perhaps we removed 3 pawns each from the board. So we removed white's pawns and black's. Then we'd be left with a bishop against 3 pawns. Remember that a king and bishop against the king is what's called a dead draw. It's impossible to checkmate with those 2 pieces. Oh, something's gone wrong there. What happened there? This is well past in the game, sorry. We're just going to run through that very quickly one more time. There we go. This is what happened. Apologies for that. Something went bizarrely wrong. Back to where we were. So you notice there that, well, black really can maintain the power of the pawns by keeping the queens on the board. But if the queens do come off, then we have potential even then to draw the game, or perhaps even to win the game. Bishop against 3 pawns is still better for the pawns because the king and bishop can't checkmate on their own. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm wondering if you can see, you might need to pause the video again. I wonder if you can see maybe a nice little trick for white to consider. Now, it may not be the best move, but it's an idea. It's a way of winning back some pawns in return for the bishop. See if you can work out what I mean. Okay. Now, it's a tricky situation because if we count the material, okay, it's fairly equal, isn't it? It's in fact, it's exactly equal. We have bishop against 3 pawns, and again, those 3 pawns are equal to these ones on the king side. We've both got a queen. I would say, although white's king is safer, it's still not completely immune from checks. We can still attack the king if we're able to control this diagonal. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of drawing chances in this game. I think the game should probably end in a draw. But white has got to make sure that he gets back some pawns in return for this bishop. So see if you could, well done if you spotted the tactical trick. It's this. We've got bishop takes, king takes, queen here, and then again we pick up this pawn, and again we look for another fork. We have a fork opportunity there. Okay, I think this is a good way to actually win material. We've actually here, let's see what happens. We actually would win. I'm just going to show you the point at which the pawn was taken. We've won 4 pawns in return for the bishop. This is actually an interesting scenario. We want to be a little bit careful, bearing in mind that black's pawn is getting close to the end. So if black did manage to swap queens, we have to be 100% sure that we can cover the pawn getting to the end with our king. So that's something to be careful of. But notice that is probably a safe way of reaching the end game for white, a pawn ahead. Notice that if things go wrong, we can start to check the king and bail out for a draw. So it moves like that. We can just try to check the king endlessly, which is a little bit kind of what happened in the end. So I thought that was an interesting game between me and a student, and it just shows the power of being able to counterattack, having this fighting spirit, and being able to turn the game around. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip on to another example here, just for a couple of minutes. We're coming to the end now, but I want to show you something very quickly. This is a game I played a couple of years ago. I was playing black in the Surrey Chess League. Now, this is mostly for adults, but there are children that play in the Surrey Chess League, and there's no reason why, if you become a stronger player, that you can't play for us. I represent Epsom Chess Club, and we've certainly got a lot of opportunities going around. At the moment, we're not playing over the board chess because of the virus, but hopefully later in the year, maybe next year, we'll be back to playing league chess again. So bear that in mind if you're interested. Okay, so in this position, well, we can count the material, but I would say this is fairly simple to count. I think you guys are high-level players, so you can probably compare pieces very easily here. We don't need to count the total value, we just need to count the number and the value of, compare the value rather, of each of the pieces, and we each have 7 pawns. Now, admittedly, this game was not particularly interesting. It's gone 20 moves, a lot of pieces have come off. There's not really a lot, well, up until this point, that I think is noteworthy. You can, I guess you can probably work out that this is, well, it's a Caro-Kann. I don't know if you can, well, you may struggle to work that out, but here we've got e4, c6, knight f3, d5. So it's a Caro-Kann kind of setup, but the pieces came off very quickly. If you want, you can do a screenshot and note down those moves. But at this point, I would like to come up with a plan. This is going to be a plan that you're going to do as kind of your homework. What would black play in this situation, given that, okay, white's pieces are sort of gradually moving across towards our king? Is there a particular move here that we think we should play? Okay, so that is your job as homework. Think how we can play this game. Should we simply defend, i.e. should we just try to transfer our pieces to the king side and try to block things up and make sure that that white doesn't get any further in his attack? Or should we do something a little different? Should we try some kind of counter attack? And if so, where would we do it? Okay, so I would say do a screenshot or pause the video here. You might want to set this board up for next time. Other than that, I think I'm just going to quickly summarize. So I'm going to unshare the screen. So it's all about that fighting spirit. Counter-attacking, especially when we're losing the game, is an extremely important thing to remember. We mustn't just roll over and allow our opponent to win the game easily. We have to be very stubborn in chess. So being stubborn is all about making sure we don't do what our opponent wants us to do. That is a surprisingly useful piece of information. I think, you know, it wasn't that long ago perhaps that I learned this, and it's extremely valuable because you can change results on the basis of more positive thinking. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that lesson. Again, just a lot of concepts maybe to take into account, but have a go at that scenario at home and see if you can come up with a way for black to, well, to make progress. I guess I'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.